Rome was one of the greatest civilizations, and few societies have made such an impact on the modern world. We owe a lot to the Romans, who, in many ways, were ahead of their time, but that doesn't mean that everything they did was perfect or even made sense, and they had really weird ideas about some things. Although it could be said that if an ancient Roman was suddenly transported here to our world, we're sure they would find some of our customs just as disturbing. With that in mind, here are 7 odd things about the Romans. Please try not to judge. Welcome to ancient Rome. The Fascinus. This was the embodiment of the divine phallus. Effigies, amulets, and spells were used to summon up divine protection. The Roman philosopher Pliny referred to it as a doctor, a cure for envy or the evil eye. The word fascinate is derived from the Latin fascinum and the verb fascinare, which means to entrance or bewitch. The Vestal Virgins, priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of hearth, home and family, took care of the cult of the Fascinus Populi Romani, the image of the sacred phallus that was a symbol of the well-being of the state. Phallic talismans, often winged, were ever present in Roman culture and took the form of lamps, carvings, wind chimes, and pieces of jewelry such as rings and pendants. These charms were thought to be especially powerful in warding off evil from children, particularly boys. Protection is thought to be related to the virility and reformative powers of an erect phallus. However, the shame or laughter created by one was also thought to distract the evil eye. Varro, who was regarded as Rome's greatest scholar, mentioned the custom of hanging a phallic amulet around a baby's neck, and some examples have been found of tiny phallus rings, far too small to be worn by adults. Death masks. Another strange decoration that Romans liked to have hanging around their homes were death masks. Aristocrats liked to keep them on display in their atriums or entrance halls. Called imagines, the masks were made from wax and pressed into the face of a man while he was still alive, probably when he was in his prime and had achieved great things in his life. They were a sign of status and remarkably lifelike. Death masks were also displayed during elite funerals where they were worn by actors and provided a link between the present and the past and were meant to motivate those attending into patriotism. Imagines were intended exclusively for high-status male citizens and politicians in Rome. Like miniature monuments, they commemorated the dead and their accomplishments. The Greek historian Polybius, who documented the rise of Rome, described the funeral of an illustrious man, saying, "When any distinguished member of the family dies, they take the death masks to the funeral, putting them on men who seem to them to bear the closest resemblance to the original in stature and carriage. When the actors appeared, they looked uncannily like the men they represented." And Polybius continued, "There could not easily be a more ennobling spectacle for a young man who aspires to fame and virtue. For who would not be inspired by the sight of the images of men renowned for their excellence, all together and as if alive and breathing?" The consul, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, was said to have been accompanied by 600 masks at his funeral in 23 BC, and the dictator and general Sulla had 6,000 masks in his cortege in 78 BC. No woman, no cry. Still on the subject of funerals, the practices surrounding them were very precise. The more people who cried at a Roman funeral, the more popular the deceased was. Some families paid women who didn't even know the dead person to turn up at the ceremony to chant the name of the deceased over and over, rip out their hair, and scratch their faces until they bled. With all the theatrics of death, mask actors, and weeping and wailing, the processions came to be seen as undignified, and crying women were banned at funerals. Some burial rites were quite unusual. Goods were placed in adult graves and might include perfumes, fine clothing, food, and drink. At some graves, libation tubes were sunk into the ground, and incense, flowers, wine, or food was poured directly in, the thought being that the dead could consume whatever was offered to them. Roman sources stated that distress over unteethed dead newborns was unreasonable, and mourning them was hysterical and self-pitying. When a person had been killed by being struck by lightning, it was believed that they had been punished by Jupiter himself, and their body belonged to him, so burial was forbidden. In Roman culture, Jupiter was the father of the gods and the god of sky and thunder. He carried thunderbolts and struck down anyone who he thought deserved it. If you broke the law and buried your lightning-hit loved one, you could expect to become Jupiter's next sacrifice. Where there's muck, there's brass. For the Romans, urine was a versatile substance that was used in sanitation, medicine, industry, cosmetics, and agriculture. Urine was highly prized when it came to personal hygiene. The author Pliny the Elder wrote that it was an efficient cleaning agent used as a mouthwash to help clean and whiten teeth. It was probably used because of its high ammonia content. It was also used in medicinal remedies for a range of ailments, including burns and ear infections, as it had an antiseptic effect. The agricultural uses of urine included its use as a fertilizer. The high nitrogen content meant that when it was sprinkled over the fields, it would enrich the soil and stimulate crop growth. Urine was so sought after that Emperor Nero brought in a urine tax in the 1st century AD, named the Vectigal Urinae. It was a levy on the disposal of urine. Urine was collected from Rome's public restrooms, where the lower classes urinated into pots, which were later emptied into cesspools. It was then used in several industrial processes, such as tanning and wool production. It was also used in laundries, where clothes were soaked in vats of urine to whiten them and remove stains, and workers, known as fullers, would stomp on them to get them scrupulously clean. Although the urine tax was abolished after Nero committed suicide and plunged Rome into a civil war, Vespasian reintroduced the tax around 70 AD as the treasury was empty and the empire needed to recover financially. A report from the historian Suetonius tells us that Vespasian's son Titus was so disgusted with the nature of the tax that he complained to his father. Vespasian stuck a gold coin under his nose and asked his son if he felt offended by its smell. When Titus replied no, Vespasian pointed out that it came from urine. Get down with the sickness. The eating habits of Romans were known to be quite disgusting. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca, who lived during the 1st century AD, highlighted the fact that at feasts among the wealthy, who could afford to gorge themselves, they vomit so they may eat, and eat so that they may vomit. It has been wrongly thought that the vomitorium referred to a room where the Romans would go off to do their vomiting, and it's easy to see how the mistake could be made. The Latin word vomere does mean to vomit or spew forth, but vomitoriums were, in fact, corridors or passageways that spectators used to reach and leave their seats at colosseums and theatres. Some of these entertainment venues were huge and hosted great crowds, sometimes as many as 150,000 people. Having large vomitoriums meant that these crowds could be filled and emptied quickly and efficiently. At banquets, though, it seems that others were happy to purge themselves after a heavy meal. Suetonius speaks about how the Emperor Claudius hardly ever left the dining room until he was stuffed and soaked. Then he went to sleep at once, lying on his back with his mouth open, and a feather was put down his throat to relieve his stomach. The Roman statesman Cicero also wrote about how Julius Caesar left feasts to go and empty his stomach. It's the slaves that we should feel sorry for, though Seneca explains. When we recline at a banquet, one slave wipes up the spittle, another, situated beneath, collects the leavings, vomit of the drunks. Lovely. No son of mine. The Romans kept a lot of slaves after all. Their empire was built on the backs of many of their conquered foes. Human rights weren't a big thing in ancient Rome either, so the lives of slaves, for the most part, were not that great. Roman citizens were spared the horrors of slavery unless they broke the law. However, there was one bizarre exception. A Roman father could, if the urge took him, rent out his son as a slave. An agreement would be reached over the price and the duration of the term of slavery between the father and the prospective buyer. This was a temporary arrangement, and it was expected that the child would return to his family in the same condition that he left. A father was only allowed to do this twice. A third term of child leasing would result in the boy being emancipated from his parents. There was no limit to the number of kids a dad could rent out. The second king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, began his reign in 715 BC. He amended the law of fathers selling their sons into slavery and gave immunity to married sons, believing that it was unfair for a wife to find herself wed to a slave when she had thought herself marrying a free man. The Romans also had a rather nasty habit of abandoning any children who they deemed unfit to live. This could be because the child had deformities, or simply because their parents could not afford to keep them. The baby was usually taken outside and left there to die, exposed to the elements. Despite having a good rep as a civilized society, infanticide was common. Technically, it was illegal, but the penalty was only a small fine. Hot blood, cold sweat. The Romans didn't have soap and would instead cover their bodies in oil and use a strigil to scrape off the oil, skin, dirt, and sweat. Vials of these scrapings taken from gladiators, who were seen as sex symbols, were used by rich Roman women as upmarket facial oils and were considered to act as an aphrodisiac. Pliny the Elder, military commander and author, reported that the blood of gladiators is drunk by epileptics as though it was the draught of life. It wasn't just their blood and sweat that was sought after either. The raw liver of a fallen gladiator was also used to treat epilepsy, known as the falling down disease. Cannibalistic remedies came from the magical idea that the energy of a young, healthy male could be harnessed at the point of death, and their vigor could somehow be passed on. After 400 AD, the gladiatorial games were banned, so the Romans began using the blood of newly executed criminals instead. Executioners had to physically fight off sick people who actively sought out fresh bodies. So thank you for watching, and until next time, keep conquering with the power of knowledge.